Well, I first visited Vilnius in 1965, so it's a great pleasure and honor to be back again, even if only electronically, at this conference. 30 years ago this month, that's in September 1991, everything was changing in Europe. The members of the Warsaw Pact had liberated themselves. Yeltsin had recognized the independence of the Baltic states, and Ukraine and the Caucasus were well on the way towards following them. We, all of us, I think, in East and West, were hugely grateful that the nuclear the nuclear threat, had been lifted from us. And Russians, my Russian friends, all hoped that their country would become what they called normal, that's to say, prosperous, open to the world, and at peace with its neighbors. It's very difficult to convey to people who weren't there quite how exciting it was. Now, when I visited Tallinn in 1965, the people there wouldn't really serve us in the shops until they realized we weren't Russian. They told us that they were living under a foreign occupation, and they talked freely about the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. We were quite surprised by how open they were. And then when I returned to Moscow in 1988 as ambassador, I wasn't allowed to go to the Baltic states because, for legal reasons, because we didn't recognize the Soviet occupation. But my people were able to go, and they went there regularly and got to know the opposition leaders in all three Baltic states well. And those people, the opposition leaders, often came to the embassy to talk to us and to meet our visitors, people like John Major and Mrs. Thatcher. We all had a strong feeling of sympathy towards the Baltic states, and because of the history, also a strong feeling of guilt towards them. But the Western allies did face a dilemma. Our overriding interest was to end the Cold War, and for that, and the threat from Russia, and for that, Gorbachev seemed our best bet. And we worried all the time, our governments worried all the time, that he might be overthrown at any time for a variety of reasons, but also if the Union republics pressed their demands for independence too hard. So our attitude was, unfortunately, ambiguous. And President Bush made that clear when he made his Chicken Kiev speech in August 1991, just before the coup happened, warning the Ukrainians against independence. He backed freedom for them, but not independence. Well, then the coup against Gorbachev happened and everything changed. Now, I've looked in my diary to remind myself of what it was like day to day. And I think throughout the first 18 months, of course, there was a continual groundswell of demands from the Baltic states for independence and warnings from my Russian friends, including those who sympathized with the Balts, that there could easily be trouble and that the army, for example, could take things into their own hands. And then, of course, the crisis broke for Lithuania in 1990 in the spring, when the Russians, Gorbachev, started taking economic measures against Lithuania. And our foreign minister, Douglas Hurd, warned him in April against heavy-handed action in Lithuania, which would destroy his credit in the West. But at the same time, Mitterrand and Kohl were advising Landsbergis to put independence on ice until he reached an agreement with Gorbachev. So we were kept informed of all these things. Mrs. Prunskina called on me in Moscow in May, and Landsbergis called on his way to meet Mrs. Thatcher in London and said very firmly that the West now had to choose between remaining true to its principles or following its interests and disgracing themselves. Then there were the shootings in Vilnius in January 1991. We first heard of them when the Lithuanian Foreign Ministry telephoned us, before it was on the news. And our ministers made forthright statements. And I had a colleague in Tallinn when Yeltsin went there to express support. And the same colleague was in Vilnius for the funeral of the victims of the shooting, when the Orthodox bishop said that the Russian people should be ashamed of what had happened. And in Riga, the Latvian prime minister told another colleague that this time the Latvians were determined not to repeat the mistake they'd made in 1940. This time they would certainly resist. Well, in Moscow, the press attacked Gorbachev unmercifully. One newspaper came out with blood pouring down its front page. Gorbachev's people did their best to defend him to me, although they were clearly unhappy. And my own driver, who of course was KGB driver, took part in the demonstrations on the streets against the shootings. I recommended to London that we should offer to help the negotiations between the Baltic states and Moscow, the negotiations for independence, but that for the negotiations to succeed, the Balts would need to offer guarantees for the rights of minorities and some recognition of the Soviet strategic interest in that part of the world. And our prime minister put those ideas to the Baltic representatives whom he met in Moscow in March 1991. Well, then the August coup took place, and we and our allies finally recognized Baltic independence. And 3 weeks later, Yeltsin called the European ambassadors into the White House to meet the representatives of the Baltic states. And one of them was Lennart Meri, the foreign minister of Estonia, who of course had spent a long time with his family in the Gulag. And he deliberately spoke in Russian. And he said that the Russians had also suffered from the Soviet dictatorship. And the Estonians, he said, of course, hated the Soviet system, but they had never hated the Russian people, whose language, literature, and culture they deeply admired. Well, it was a very moving speech in the circumstances. And it's a great pity that the hopes that we all had in those days, we were all sort of intoxicated with hope in those days, that those hopes have not been realized. And we're back in a something close to a confrontation with Russia, but of course with the Baltic states, now our allies in NATO. Thank you.